introduce, as you can see, Dr. Carrie Kisker, who I met recently, and I urge everyone to get her book and read it. It's highly compelling. And I can't think of a better guest to kick this thing off because, you know, what she brings to the table are what I think of as practical and proven approaches, ways to help institutions transform the way they approach the situation we're in today. The risk driven by cuts in budget predominantly in this target population we're talking about, but recently, tremendous opportunity with the Biden administration, money coming into the sector. I can't think of a better time to really get into the nuts and bolts of what a conversion to more entrepreneurial thinking and operations means today. So welcome, Dr. Kisker. I think the Quiller should be live at this point, but Dr. Kisker has taught, she has a PhD and has taught at both UCLA and UC Riverside and is focused on this market and continues to focus as the principal of Kisker Consulting. So as I said, even as the Biden administration investments were sort of pending, my immediate reaction to this book was optimism, because you've really described where the urgency of this moment has been converted into entrepreneurial energy that drove a scaled out shift in the campus operating mindset. So if you could just briefly describe a couple of those examples to the audience.
My pleasure. I really like your term, excuse me, entrepreneurial energy, Mark, because many campuses have examples of entrepreneurial projects or programs, but in my experience, few have been able to capture that entrepreneurial spirit or energy or mindset and scale it out through all corners of the college or university. And I really believe that that's what it's going to take for us to surmount the series of obstacles we have in front of us right now. The key to that in my mind is not any particular leader or idea or location or vertical or anything else. The key to that for me is culture. And that comes down to institutional leadership primarily. When we can establish and reward and support cultures that embrace the tenets of entrepreneurship and innovation, then we start seeing innovative ideas cropping up from all corners of the colleges, right? From faculty, curricular processes start getting a whole lot more interesting and hopefully faster, to new programs and new verticals, to new technological ways of delivering on our mission and serving students and so forth. I'll give you a couple examples of community colleges, which is probably 80% of my work these days, of where I think I've seen this sort of cultural shift towards your term, entrepreneurial energy. And they focused on different aspects of the culture. The Maricopa Community Colleges in Phoenix, at least several of their colleges have really embraced the idea of risk-taking and failing fast and rewarding the failures as much as the successes. Especially Rio Salado College, which is probably the most famous and first college without walls, online college, has had a long history of doing this. You try something, it doesn't work, but you actually learn more from that and you build it into the next iteration of whatever you're trying. North Iowa Area Community College in Mason City, Iowa is a tiny little school in a very rural area. They have gone further than any other institution I know in trying to incorporate an entrepreneurial mindset and tenets of thinking throughout all corners of their college. They've done that through community book reads over the summer focused on an entrepreneurial mindset. They've mandated that all student success courses utilize design thinking and an entrepreneurial mindset in the way they teach students and the way they give them the skills they think they need to be successful in college. They have faculty training other faculty in how to incorporate this into science classes, agriculture classes, math courses, not just business curriculum or those courses that are highly connected to the workforce. So those are two examples. The third example I'll give for this, as you said, Mark, scaled out utilization of entrepreneurial energy is at Valencia College in Florida. And the way that they've done this is, I would say, extreme collaboration and communication, but they also have a very tight and highly publicized process for their innovations, where they sort of welcome all kinds of new ideas and give them a tiny little bit of funding to start off with the idea. If it's proven, if they can show data that it's working, that it's meeting the need identified at the beginning, then they find a way to scale that. And it's 4 or 5 steps, with the last few steps being really institutionalization across all of the campuses in that college and long-term sustainable funding. So that process is also really helpful because it tells everybody in the college that they have a role to play if they have an idea and that they will be given support for that along the way. And it also encourages, as I'm sure everybody knows, use of data to show the successes and also be able to learn from the failures.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I know of and have worked with at least 2 of those institutions during my career at PeopleSoft or Oracle. So, one of the themes that we're exploring almost throughout all the sessions today is technology investment to support the pursuit of strategic opportunity and risk management, also known as entrepreneurship, as opposed to a big previously defined project. So I'm going to leave the for-profit sector aside for a moment. Can you just summarize what those tenets of entrepreneurship are in a community college context?
Sure. In the book that you very graciously held up earlier, I define entrepreneurship as broadly as possible. I define it as taking measured risks to create something different that has a positive impact on students or communities. So it includes the notion of risk-taking, which I think is critical. The something different is, I think I'm preaching to the choir with this group, right? Something different is going to be necessary at this point. And the positive impact on students or communities is the key, because it's opportunity for what is the big question for me. And that is, in community colleges in particular, we serve 2 masters. We serve the students who come to us and who we should be inviting and welcoming. And we serve the communities where the colleges are located. And the mission of the institution has, and I will say this, the way we have enacted the mission of a community college has been primarily focused on students over the last 100 years. And I think that is starting to change. And I think therein lies a lot of opportunity, both in terms of technology utilization, but also in general, to serve our communities in different ways, whether that's in workforce development, working to improve the regional economic sustainability and growth of the area, whether that is more social entrepreneurship and what role are we providing as a public good. But I think we're starting to think in this sector in particular, and probably should be in all sectors of higher education, about how to serve those masters and potentially, utilize market-driven or technology-driven strategies for doing that. And I think the key takeaway for me with this definition is that it could be utilized by anyone in our colleges and universities, faculty, administrators, vendors, CIOs, et cetera. But it also keeps the pursuit of monetary profit or the mitigation of institutional cost as a means to an end, as a strategy, rather than an end in itself, which many people think is antithetical to the higher education purpose.
Okay.
Mark, really quick, when you think about design thinking and you think of it as like changing processes or creating a product and so forth, the knowledge that faculty disseminate is somewhat of a product, right? How do you put that spin into for faculty to recognize that they have to think about design thinking in their way of how they approach their ecosystem? I know that Isabel, I see Christine from Minerva on, hello, how do you think about design thinking for faculty and getting them to buy into that? Because I think buy-in and getting consensus on a design thinking has to come from all of the campuses, including faculty, including administrations, including alumni, including students and parents. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I assume that question's for me, but I'm happy to let Mark answer it as well. I think you're 100% right with that, Matt. And I think we need our faculty to embrace these concepts if we are going to become truly entrepreneurial as institutions. The key to me is to avoid the term buy-in and think about it more in terms of collaborative decision-making. So what that means to me is that faculty need to be involved in and communicated with at every step of a design process, and that their needs need to be factored in as well as student needs and community needs. They are, they are the reason we exist as institutions, right? Their expertise is what we sell. But I will disagree with you a little bit, Matt. I don't think faculty tend to see the knowledge they disseminate as their product. I think they tend to see their students as, for lack of a better term, their product. So the way I think we get into faculty's hearts and minds and hopefully processes is to utilize the design thinking problem, which really focuses on aggressive empathy with stakeholder needs, and ask them to look deeply at what their students need, and not what they can provide their students, but what their students need. And ultimately, what their students need in some ways is what we've always been providing. That doesn't mean we can't do it better. But what students need today is different than what students needed 10 years ago. And it is certainly different than what students needed 100 years ago. And it is probably very different than what students need 10 years from now. And that's where we need to be involving faculty in these thought processes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think in some ways, so one of my favorite quotes that you use in your book, and I think it's even in the Quiller, is if you don't like change, you'll like irrelevance even less. And I think, as you note, and many folks have experienced on this call, community colleges have been under pressure for decades now to always do more to serve the changing needs of their community within increasing limitations of their budget. So now we're in the age of, as I said, we started out with COVID. Now there's some funding coming. Is that changed any of these fundamentals, or is it just raising the degree of urgency? Or is this just a challenge, in fact, that goes beyond the community colleges and is impacting the majority of what I'll just call non-research universities and colleges?
Well, I think that's a great point, because I think many of the challenges that community colleges face are also faced by many four-year institutions, both public and private, with the possible exception of the flagships, which have other pressures, right? I think the quote you said is originally a quote from Army General Eric Shinseki, and I love it because it puts it into a pretty stark terms that you either change or you're left behind. In my mind, community colleges and many colleges and universities in the four-year sector were already in an existential crisis before the past year. The difference is now everybody knows it within and without the colleges, right? And so I think there's more urgency around the need to change. Yes, there's a huge infusion of federal dollars coming in, but those are not going to be sustainable over time, and they are going to have to be used relatively quickly, which means that it's not necessarily the easiest way to transform on a long-term basis. With that said, we have incredible opportunity to leverage those funds to start innovation processes. I think the other thing that the COVID pandemic and certainly the ensuing economic and for community college enrollment fallouts showed us is that it is possible to pivot on a dime. I mean, higher education has often, the analogies range from herding cats to steering turning a large ship into the wind to whatever have you, but all of them basically come down to there's a heavy trend towards inertia in higher education. And COVID showed us that when you have to change quickly, you can. Now, we didn't always change in the most effective or useful ways, And I can talk a little bit about what that in a minute. I think, Mark, you had another question about that, but it showed us that change is possible quickly.
Hey, Mark, really quick, there's a question in the audience from Eric. I don't know if Eric is camera ready. He's a handsome fella. But Eric, you want to pop up and ask your question, or do you want Matt Alex to put his spin on it?
Sure. Hey, Matt. Hey, everyone. Eric Leftwich. I'm not camera ready, but my question, when you talked about the institution really needs to fit the students' needs, and we're faced at this time where information is readily available and more than it's ever been, but the cost of education been so expensive. How would you define that list of students' needs right now? What are they, as you've conducted your research and study?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Many much smarter futurists than me have attempted to answer the same thing. And a lot of times it comes down to, for lack of a better term, the soft skills. And I would add to that the soft skills applied in the real world. So the traditional way we've taught our students in both 2- and 4-year institutions is through the liberal arts, right? We learn how to connect different strands of ideas. We learn how to think critically. We learn how to work in groups with different people. We learn how to deal with disagreement and all of that. I think where the community college sector is leading is showing how we can connect some of those skills with workforce preparation. So whereas the community college technical education, I think for most of their history has focused on teaching skills to be used in a job, now we're starting to shift towards incorporating a lot of these mindset and I guess habits of mind would be the way to term it, that we have traditionally taught through the liberal arts into these workforce connected programs. And to me, I think that's going to have to happen all the way through the research universities and into graduate school as well. We need to think about connecting habits of mind to the workforce experience through internships, through summer jobs, through what have you. There's a number of different ways. Paid employment that maybe you leave the institution and then come back as you're trying to scale up. And I also think that we need to be highly aware, Eric, that the needs of our students tomorrow are going to be different than today, and to build that into our thinking so that we don't think we have the answer and just try to do that for the next 10 years. We're going to have to be learning, I think, as we go. So there's a non-answer for you, but
and a good one it was. A quick follow on, based on Biden's speech last night. I come from the perspective as a vendor, right? We have career discernment software in my company. That's what we've been. The idea that fitting skills to individuals so they can go get jobs hasn't really ever changed the economic landscape. 50% of the American population that has a job is not engaged. Only 30% of the American population is happy with the work that they do. And a survey of the people that actually use their degree in the field of work is abysmal. And so with that in mind, the president speaks and he says, this is a workforce initiative. This is a Reskill America initiative. How did that resonate with you last night when we start talking about putting skills in the hands of learners so that they can go to work? I'm just curious of this group. How did that resonate? How did you guys feel about that? Is that relevant? Is that right? What's the thought process here?
Well, it's not a radical shift for those of us who work in community colleges. We've been thinking in these terms for a long time. And I, who was educated not in community colleges, and so have experience with top flight research and universities and colleges as well, think that there is a role for that everywhere. But I think the danger is in this is that we run into a tracking system. And we've been, heavily aware of this, that we track certain students toward immediate employment and short-term certificates, and then others toward, for lack of a better term, more traditional 4-year degrees. I don't want to get too much into that because I think that's a much larger conversation, a philosophical conversation. But I think that for those of us who work in the 2-year sector, it's not a shocking turn of events.
So yeah, I'd like to get back to some, because there's some really important, I think, practical aspects I want to get out on the table. For those of you that are submitting comments, we'll track them and try and get you responses after the session if we run out of time. But so I've got perhaps a simplified view of our circumstances, but that it requires a growth mindset accompanied by entrepreneurial reflexes. Okay, so those are two sides of the same coin, and campuses need to understand and adopt that to move with purpose through this evolutionary phase, not just reactionary, which I think you noted a lot of campuses reacted with differing results. So a lot of people on campus admit right out of the gate that they have not developed the skills to really operate in that kind of environment. And I think this is where your book fills in a vital missing component. My simple statement is a growth mindset embraces operational and design thinking. It can build those reflexes even in a higher ed setting. I mean, is that essentially?
For sure. Yeah,
okay?
Absolutely. And I think part of the growth mindset as applied to higher education is two things. It's recognition of the need for change, which may well be there more widely after this past year, but isn't always there. There are many, many people in our institutions who don't see the need for change. So part of that is pointing out, listen, we're getting 20% less per full-time equivalent student than we were 15 years ago. And the trend is only going, our federal cash notwithstanding. We are training students for the jobs of 30 years ago, not the jobs 10 years from now. So part of that is education, right? And then the other part of it is helping those of us who work in the colleges take a more expansive view of the opportunities that exist. And that, to me, is where you rope people in, and people, even faculty who may have resisted these ideas, start getting really excited about what's possible.
Okay, yeah, and I think I had a friend of mine who works on a campus saying, I swear some days I think we'd rather go out of business than change the way we do things. But so what are the fundamentals of design thinking in this context of the higher ed enterprise?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I'm assuming that most of the people on this Zoom right now have at least heard of the concept of design thinking, which is essentially a way of designing new products or services from the perspective of empathy for stakeholders. So what are our stakeholders' needs? And then how do we think broadly about meeting those needs? In the Quiller feed, there's what I call my design thinking approach to mission-oriented change, which I want to explain the context for a little bit before we get into design thinking in general. But I find it really, really important in higher education to emphasize the mission-oriented nature of this framework, because many people, faculty and others, have a lot of fears around what entrepreneurship and innovation mean for them, for their students, for their ability to make their course loads, for their future at the institution, and so forth. And a lot of those fears revolve around a perceived market orientation. Oh, we're just chasing the money. This has nothing to do with what we should be doing. So I see design thinking and other frameworks for organizational change, but in particular design thinking, as an essential way to combat the zero-sum notion that we either serve students or serve the market. I think because it prioritizes the mission of the institution, and in particular, the needs of students, communities, and other stakeholders all the way through the process, we can sort of move past that and remain mission-oriented in the pursuit of financial sustainability. So design thinking comes out of the business world and product development, but it's been extended to many other sectors, including education. And then I think many design thinkers see education as the real frontier for application of design thinking. My model is adapted from one that came out in a 2017 book called Design Thinking for the Greater Good by a handful of researchers at Columbia University. And they attempted to simplify and apply the tenets of design thinking to the social and public sector. And they simplified it into 4 questions, which you can see in the Quiller feed. What is, what if, what wows, and what works. So in my book, and as you see in the Quiller feed, I've adapted this model further to be used specifically for community colleges, although I think there's a lot of crossover to the higher education sector in general. And it takes into account things like academic freedom and the pressures that exist with that in terms of decision-making and governance at the college. The siloed nature of academic work, the fact that we as community colleges and many universities serve communities as well as students, and so forth. So just briefly, Mark, you asked that I give some examples as we go through here, and I'll do that briefly, but I'm also
Great.
mindful of the time. The process is depicted as linear. It is not, and it shouldn't be conceived that way, but too many squirrels and whirls make my mind go blank. So, you know, if you were to start at the beginning of the process, you would start by sort of understanding what are the basic workforce needs in the community? What are the economic development goals of our city or our community? What skills do our students need, to get to Eric's question earlier, now and in the future? And again, it's really focused on that unmet need thing. How can we do something different that has an impact on a need that isn't being met? So you have all kinds of examples of this in my book, and I'm not going to talk too much in particular about any one of those, but I'm happy to get back to it later. You move from an understanding of your current context into the really fun part for those of us who are used to thinking this way, which is sort of the question, what if? But I think it's important to recognize that this is not an easy thing for many in higher education, right? Thinking, what if, putting aside constraints, some which are fungible, some that are not, for the time being. But this is a mind shift, a paradigm shift for many in higher education, but it's the most important part of the process, because this is where innovation comes in. This is where we stop saying, well, we can't do this because, and start thinking like, well, let's forget about the why we can't do that for now. What would we get if we do this? What needs do we serve? How do we move our processes forward? And then it becomes sort of an iterative process of testing your idea out in smaller to larger ways, which, going back to those same stakeholders, getting their feedback, which of course is humbling many times, and probably where we start facing a lot of resistance. And I talk a lot about in my book the fact that resistance is great. Resistance is really good. Resistance helps us check our assumptions. Resistance helps us stay tied to the public good of what we do. It can also be really frustrating, and it can slow things down. But it's probably the most important part of the process to learn how to do this. And this is where you fail fast. Oh, I forgot about this. That's not going to work because of this. How do we adjust it? How do we meet the stakeholder need in a better way? That sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I know I used to think of that as creative tension. Well, we're going to go a little bit long, but let's wrap up by talking about the folks on this call.
Hey, Mark, on all respect, like, we're gonna have to, we're gonna go the way that we normally would do. We want to get this in 30 blocks. So Carrie, I love the fact that you're here. We'd welcome you to stay and join the conversation. Mark, we're going 30. Otherwise, we're going to go into a traditional webinar, and that's not what we're going to do. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So I'm going to plant my flag, because I think a lot of this is about dialogue and moving through. There's so much here. Carrie, I love where you're going with this discussion, but I'd like to transition this a little bit to Rupal Shah, who's coming in. And Mark, hold your questions in terms of Carrie, because we're going to have, hopefully, Carrie, if you can come back when we do this. We have our break, but people don't leave other than just that. So we can do that. Mark, are you okay with that? I want to follow the format of this. Otherwise,
yeah, no, I'm good, Matt. I just, the one point I wanted to make sure we made was, and I think it's made in the book, is that while there's a lot of folks on this call that are responsible for implementing policies and programs through technology or administrative processes, I don't think there's any reason for them to wait for direction, and in fact should lean into design thinking, and not wait for their institution not contribute to some of the inertia I think we all feel. And to me, that was another key takeaway in this book. And I think Carrie has experienced that in some of these institutions and seen how that's made a difference.
Sure. Yeah, it doesn't, these things don't start with the president or chancellor of a college saying, okay, now everybody's going to do it this way. It starts by individual people in individual corners of the institution saying, I'm going to apply this way of thinking and problem solving and innovating to my problem at hand. And I'm going to involve the stakeholders and people around me so they see that process. And that maybe then when they have a challenge they need to figure out how to deal with, they come to me and say, how did you do that? How can I incorporate similar processes? And it snowballs from there. And hopefully you have leadership who is receptive and supportive of this as well, but we can't always rely on that. So we need to introduce it when and how we can.